Carl Jung never directly studied avoidant attachment because the modern attachment framework was developed long after his major psychological theories were introduced. However, Jung spent a great deal of time exploring something he called the refusal of individuation, the process of becoming fully aware of and accepting all parts of oneself. When we examine Jung's ideas through the perspective of avoidant attachment, the connection becomes surprisingly clear. Jung believed that every person carries a shadow, which is the hidden part of the personality that contains emotions, desires, fears, and needs that the conscious mind does not want to accept. It holds everything that does not match the identity someone has created and decided to show to the world. For someone with avoidant patterns, this shadow can become extremely heavy because their entire self-image may depend on appearing completely independent and emotionally unaffected. The avoidant often builds an identity around being strong, self-reliant, and needing very little from others. But maintaining that image requires pushing away many normal human experiences that everyone carries. The desire for connection gets hidden away. The fear of losing someone gets buried. The pain from relationships that never had the chance to fully develop remains unprocessed. Even the deep desire to be loved without having to control every emotion, explain every feeling, or constantly protect oneself from vulnerability becomes something that is pushed into the unconscious. The person may convince themselves that they do not need these things, but Jung would argue that these rejected parts do not disappear. They simply move into the shadow, waiting to be recognized and integrated. This is where Jung's perspective becomes challenging because he made an argument that many people found uncomfortable. He believed that refusing to acknowledge the shadow was not just a psychological struggle, but also a failure of personal responsibility. He was not talking about blame, punishment, or shame. Instead, he meant that every person has a responsibility to understand the hidden parts of themselves, because those unrecognized parts can influence the way they treat others. According to Jung, what we refuse to confront within ourselves often finds a way to appear in our relationships. We may not do it intentionally, and we may not even realize it is happening, but the patterns created by our unresolved inner conflicts can repeatedly affect the people around us. For someone with avoidant tendencies, refusing to explore their deeper fears, emotional needs, and unresolved pain can create consequences that eventually impact the people closest to them. The emotions they try to escape internally may be expressed through distance, withdrawal, emotional walls, or pushing away someone who genuinely cares about them. In this way, the person they love may end up carrying the weight of a battle that actually began inside the avoidant themselves. But this idea needs to be understood carefully because Jung's perspective can easily be misunderstood. Recognizing that avoidant behavior involves choices and personal responsibility does not mean removing empathy or ignoring the emotional wounds behind those behaviors. The pain that created the defense is real. The fear that shaped the pattern is real. But healing requires more than simply having a wound. It requires the courage to acknowledge it, understand it, and take responsibility for how it affects others. The experiences that shaped the original wound were never something the person chose. A child who grows up believing that emotional needs are dangerous or that dependence leads to disappointment did not consciously decide to develop those beliefs. They adapted to the environment they were placed in. They found whatever emotional defenses helped them feel safe and used those strategies to survive. But the difference between the child and the adult is awareness. An adult who continues living through those same protective patterns, especially after encountering the possibility of healing and seeing the consequences those patterns create in relationships, has a level of choice and responsibility that the child never had. The survival response may have started as protection, but continuing to live through it without examining it becomes a conscious responsibility. This was something Jung strongly emphasized when discussing the role of personal growth and psychological maturity. Jung described what he called the provisional life, a way of existing where someone constantly postpones their true emotional development. It is the mindset of believing that real life will begin later, once everything feels perfect, once circumstances become easier, once they finally feel prepared. It is waiting for the right moment to become fully present, to face fears, to embrace vulnerability, and to allow genuine connection. For someone with avoidant patterns, this can look like believing that intimacy will become possible when the right person arrives and somehow makes closeness feel completely safe without requiring them to confront their own fears. Jung viewed this kind of waiting as one of the deepest tragedies of human existence, not because the person is bad or incapable of love, but because they are denying themselves the opportunity to become who they truly could be, while the people close to them experience the emotional consequences of that distance. Through a Jungian perspective, an avoidant person who continues hiding, pulling away, creating emotional barriers, while still sending subtle signs of attachment and longing, may be living what Jung called a provisional existence. They are postponing their fullest emotional life and keeping important parts of themselves locked away behind defenses that were originally created during a time when those defenses were necessary. The problem is that what protected them as a child can become the very thing that prevents them from experiencing connection as an adult. A wall that once provided safety can eventually become a prison. The person may still reach toward love, but only from behind the protection they refuse to lower. They remain caught between wanting closeness and fearing what closeness reveals about them. Jung's most challenging idea about the shadow was that when people refuse to acknowledge it for too long, it does not simply remain hidden. It begins influencing their behavior. The rejected parts of themselves start expressing themselves through the very situations they are trying to avoid. When we translate this idea into the experience of being connected with someone who has avoidant patterns, it explains why the relationship itself can become the place where their deepest conflicts appear. Their withdrawal may not only be about the person in front of them, it may also be a reaction to everything that person awakens inside them. The connection becomes a mirror reflecting emotions, needs, fears, and desires they have spent years trying to keep buried. Without even realizing it, they may use the relationship as a place where their inner conflict plays out. Your emotional openness may have reflected the feelings they learned to suppress. Your willingness to express love may have reminded them of their own hidden desire for closeness. Your ability to be vulnerable may have challenged the belief that needing someone automatically leads to weakness or pain. In that moment, you were not simply another person in their life. You became a reflection of the parts of themselves they had not yet accepted. And that reflection can feel both deeply attractive and deeply threatening because it forces them to come closer to the very emotions they have spent years avoiding. Instead of accepting those reflections as opportunities for growth, as chances to finally face and integrate the hidden parts of themselves that Jung believed were essential to psychological maturity, the avoidant often moves away from the very things that could help them heal. And in many cases, that means moving away from you. This idea can feel uncomfortable because it challenges the easier explanations we often create for painful experiences. But sometimes the truth is more valuable when it is clearly acknowledged rather than softened into something that feels easier to accept. Jung believed that avoiding this inner work over an entire lifetime creates consequences, not necessarily through a dramatic breakdown or obvious destruction, but through a quiet shrinking of the self. A person slowly becomes more restricted, more guarded, and less connected to the full emotional experience that life has to offer. The person who continues avoiding their shadow does not simply stay frozen in the same place forever. They do not remain exactly the same while their defenses stay untouched. Instead, their world gradually becomes smaller. The emotions they allow themselves to experience become fewer. The relationships they can tolerate become limited to what feels predictable and controllable. Over time, the walls that were originally created for protection begin limiting the very connection they secretly desire. The version of themselves that could have been emotionally open, deeply connected, and fully present becomes harder to access. The person beneath the defenses slowly disappears further behind the structure they have built. Jung considered this one of the deepest human losses, not simply suffering or failure, but the tragedy of an unlived life, the tragedy of having a fuller version of yourself within you, yet never allowing it to emerge. Now, I want to bring this back to your experience because it is important to understand what this perspective means for your role in the situation. It is easy to spend all your energy trying to understand the avoidant person, their fears, their wounds, and the reasons behind their behavior. But Jung's ideas also point towards something important about your own journey. He believed that one of the strongest opportunities for another person's growth does not come from chasing them, endlessly waiting for them, or sacrificing yourself in the name of understanding. It comes from refusing to carry what belongs to them. When you constantly explain away their distance, ignore your own emotional needs, adjust yourself to make their avoidance easier, or accept less than you deserve so they can continue believing they do not need anyone, you begin carrying the emotional weight they have avoided facing. From a Jungian perspective, you are taking responsibility for their shadow instead of allowing them to encounter it themselves. You are holding the pain, confusion, and consequences that would otherwise encourage them to look inward. And when someone else continuously absorbs those consequences, there is less pressure for them to confront the patterns keeping them stuck. Your emotional honesty, your ability to stand firmly in who you are, your willingness to acknowledge your needs, and your desire for a balanced connection are not attacks against an avoidant person. They are actually a reflection of what healthy emotional growth requires. Your wholeness can become an invitation for them to face themselves, but whether they accept that invitation is something you cannot control. Jung was very clear that no person can complete another person's individuation process. You cannot force someone to confront their shadow. You cannot pull someone into healing before they are willing to step toward it themselves. True transformation only happens when the individual chooses to face what they have been avoiding, often when the discomfort of staying the same becomes greater than the fear of changing. What you can control is protecting your own growth while they decide what they want to do with theirs. Your responsibility is not to become smaller so someone else can remain comfortable. Your responsibility is to continue becoming whole, to protect your own emotional journey, and to avoid being pulled into someone else's refusal to face themselves. Jung's most challenging perspective on avoidance, when viewed through the understanding I have gained from clinical work, comes down to this: an avoidant person is not permanently defined by their wound. They are not simply powerless against the patterns created by their past. Instead, they are standing at a psychological crossroads. They are facing a choice between continuing a protected, limited version of life and stepping into a more authentic, emotionally connected existence. The difficulty is that crossing that threshold requires confronting fears they have spent years trying to escape. It requires letting go of defenses that once provided safety but now prevent deeper connection. Everything they have done, the moments that hurt you, the confusion they created, the distance that made you question yourself, and the experiences that left you feeling unseen, can be understood as the actions of someone repeatedly standing at that doorway and choosing to step backward. They choose the familiarity of emotional protection over the uncertainty of vulnerability. They choose the smaller world they understand instead of the larger, more meaningful life they could experience if they allowed themselves to truly open. But that threshold belongs to them. The decision to cross it, the courage required to face what has been hidden, and the responsibility for their own growth all belong to them. You cannot walk through that doorway for someone else. You cannot convince someone to become ready before they are willing to confront themselves. Your role is not to stand outside that door waiting forever, hoping your love will eventually do the work they must choose for themselves. And you, with your ability to feel deeply, to remain open, to seek understanding, and to continue becoming a more complete version of yourself despite the pain you experienced, have already faced your own threshold. You have already done the difficult work of confronting emotions, accepting vulnerability, and choosing growth over protection. That journey matters. Your willingness to stay connected to your own heart while honoring your own worth is not something small. It is evidence that you have already crossed a doorway that many people spend years avoiding. When we talk about a threshold in psychological terms, it represents a moment of transition where a person is standing between two different ways of existing. It is the space between what feels familiar and what requires growth. For someone with avoidant patterns, this threshold can represent the choice between staying protected behind emotional defenses or moving toward deeper connection and vulnerability. The difficulty is that growth often requires stepping into uncertainty. The person has to face emotions, fears, and needs that they have spent years trying to control or suppress. The threshold is not just a moment of decision. It is a psychological challenge where someone must decide whether they will continue repeating old survival patterns or begin creating a different relationship with themselves and others. The idea of the provisional life refers to a way of living where someone constantly postpones their true emotional experience. It is like telling yourself that you will fully live, love, or open up later when the circumstances become perfect. A person living provisionally may believe they will become vulnerable when they meet the right person, when they feel completely safe, or when there is no possibility of getting hurt. But the problem is that life rarely provides complete certainty. Waiting for the perfect conditions can become a way of avoiding the very experiences that create growth. Instead of actively participating in life, the person remains in preparation mode, always believing that the real version of themselves will appear at some future point. Emotional defenses are the protective strategies people develop to avoid pain, rejection, disappointment, or emotional overwhelm. These defenses are not created because someone is weak. Usually they develop because at some point in life they served an important purpose. A child who learns that expressing emotions leads to criticism, neglect, or disappointment may begin hiding their feelings as a way to feel safer. The challenge is that these defenses can remain active even when the original danger is no longer present. What once protected someone can later prevent them from experiencing closeness, trust, and emotional intimacy. Vulnerability is another important concept because it represents the willingness to be seen honestly without hiding behind control or perfection. Vulnerability does not mean being powerless or allowing others to hurt you. It means having the courage to express feelings, needs, fears, and desires while accepting that emotional connection always carries some level of risk. For someone who fears dependence or emotional exposure, vulnerability can feel threatening because it challenges the belief that staying distant is the safest way to avoid pain. The idea of personal agency refers to the ability a person has to make choices and take responsibility for their actions, even when their past experiences influence their behavior. A person's wounds may explain why they developed certain patterns, but those wounds do not have to control every future decision. Agency begins when someone becomes aware of their patterns and chooses whether they want to continue living through them or begin changing them. Understanding someone's pain and holding them accountable for their choices can exist at the same time. Wholeness refers to the process of becoming more complete within yourself by accepting all parts of who you are. It does not mean becoming perfect or never experiencing fear. It means recognizing both the comfortable and uncomfortable parts of yourself instead of rejecting the emotions, needs, or experiences that do not fit your preferred identity. When someone moves toward wholeness, they no longer have to spend all their energy protecting an image of who they think they should be. They become more authentic, more emotionally balanced, and more capable of creating genuine connections. The concept of crossing your own threshold represents personal growth and transformation. It means reaching a point where you choose to face yourself rather than continue running from uncomfortable truths. For one person, this may mean learning to communicate emotions. For another, it may mean accepting their need for connection or letting go of patterns that no longer serve them. Crossing that threshold is not about becoming someone completely different. It is about allowing the parts of yourself that were hidden, rejected, or ignored to finally have a place in your life. The concept of the shadow is one of the most important ideas connected to Jung's psychology. The shadow is not the bad part of a person or something that represents evil. It is the hidden side of the personality that contains emotions, desires, fears, memories, and needs that a person has learned to ignore, reject, or hide. Many people create a certain image of themselves and then push away anything that does not match that image. For example, someone who strongly identifies as independent may reject their natural desire for support and closeness because they believe needing others makes them weak. But the rejected parts do not disappear. They continue influencing thoughts, emotions, and behaviors from a place outside conscious awareness. Shadow integration means becoming willing to acknowledge these hidden parts instead of constantly fighting against them. Shadow integration is the process of bringing awareness to the parts of yourself that you have avoided or denied. It does not mean accepting every behavior without responsibility. It means understanding where certain reactions come from and recognizing the emotions underneath them. A person who integrates their shadow begins to understand their fears, insecurities, and unmet needs, instead of allowing those hidden parts to control their actions. For someone with avoidant patterns, this may involve accepting that the desire for closeness does exist, even if intimacy feels uncomfortable. It may mean recognizing that emotional distance is not always a sign of strength, and that protecting yourself from possible pain can also prevent you from experiencing meaningful connection. Self-protection is another important term because many emotional patterns begin as attempts to keep a person safe. The human mind naturally creates strategies to avoid experiences that once felt threatening. If someone experienced rejection, emotional neglect, or inconsistency in the past, they may learn to protect themselves by becoming less dependent, less expressive, or less emotionally available. The problem is not that self-protection exists. The problem happens when the same protection continues operating long after the original danger has passed. A person may continue building walls around themselves even when they are with someone who wants to understand and support them. Emotional availability refers to a person's ability to recognize, express, and respond to emotions in a healthy way. It involves being present with another person, allowing yourself to be known, and having the ability to engage with emotional experiences instead of immediately escaping from them. Someone can care deeply and still struggle with emotional availability because feelings may trigger fear, discomfort, or a sense of losing control. Emotional availability is not about constantly expressing emotions or being vulnerable every moment. It is about having the capacity to stay connected when emotions appear, instead of automatically creating distance. The idea of a defended life refers to living primarily through protection rather than authentic expression. A defended person may spend a great deal of energy controlling situations, managing emotions, and avoiding anything that makes them feel exposed. This lifestyle can create a sense of safety because fewer things feel unpredictable, but it can also limit emotional freedom. The person may avoid pain, but they may also avoid joy, intimacy, excitement, and deep connection. A defended life often feels controlled, but over time it can become restrictive because the same walls that block hurt can also block meaningful experiences. Authenticity means living in alignment with your true feelings, values, and needs, rather than constantly adjusting yourself to meet expectations or avoid discomfort. In relationships, authenticity requires honesty about what you feel and what you need. It does not mean demanding that another person fulfill every emotional need, but it does mean refusing to abandon yourself to maintain a connection. When someone becomes more authentic, they stop performing a version of themselves designed only to keep others comfortable. They begin creating relationships where both people can show up as they truly are. This is often where real emotional intimacy begins, because connection cannot fully develop when one person is always hiding behind a carefully protected identity. The idea of emotional responsibility is closely connected to personal growth and maturity. Emotional responsibility means recognizing that while our feelings and wounds may come from experiences we did not choose, we still have a role in how we handle them and how they affect the people around us. It is the difference between understanding why someone behaves a certain way and using that understanding as a reason to avoid change. A person can have compassion for their own struggles while also accepting that their unresolved pain may influence others. Emotional responsibility is not about blaming someone for having wounds. It is about acknowledging that healing requires participation, awareness, and the willingness to create healthier patterns. The term psychological agency refers to the ability to make conscious choices instead of being completely controlled by automatic reactions. Everyone develops patterns based on their experiences, especially during childhood, but those patterns do not have to define an entire lifetime. Agency begins when a person becomes aware of their habits, recognizes their impact, and decides whether those habits still serve them. Someone with avoidant tendencies may have learned to withdraw whenever emotions become intense, but psychological agency allows them to question that reaction. Instead of automatically creating distance, they can begin exploring what they are feeling and why closeness creates discomfort. Relational patterns describe the repeated ways people behave and respond within relationships. These patterns influence how someone communicates, handles conflict, receives love, and reacts to emotional closeness. Many relationship behaviors are not random. They are connected to earlier experiences and beliefs about connection. For example, someone who believes that needing another person leads to disappointment may create distance whenever a relationship becomes emotionally significant. Understanding relational patterns helps people see that certain reactions are learned responses rather than fixed personality traits. Once a pattern becomes visible, it creates an opportunity for change because awareness is the first step toward choosing a different response. The concept of emotional intimacy goes beyond simply spending time with someone or having strong feelings for them. Emotional intimacy is the ability to allow another person to know your inner world, including your thoughts, fears, hopes, and vulnerabilities. It requires trust and the willingness to be seen without constantly managing how you appear. For people who fear emotional dependence, intimacy can feel risky because it removes the protection created by distance. However, genuine connection requires a balance between independence and openness. Emotional intimacy does not take away someone's individuality. Instead, it allows two people to remain themselves while creating a deeper bond. The fear of vulnerability often develops when a person connects emotional openness with danger or weakness. Someone may believe that if they reveal their true feelings, they will lose control, become dependent, or eventually experience rejection. This fear can create a habit of staying emotionally guarded even when they desire closeness. Vulnerability requires courage because it involves accepting that relationships always contain some uncertainty. No person can guarantee they will never be hurt, but avoiding vulnerability completely also prevents them from experiencing the safety, trust, and connection they want. The idea of emotional walls represents the protective barriers people create to keep painful experiences away. These walls can appear as silence, withdrawal, excessive independence, avoiding difficult conversations, or minimizing emotional needs. At first, these walls may feel helpful because they reduce immediate discomfort. They create a sense of control and distance from situations that feel overwhelming. But emotional walls have a hidden cost because they do not only block pain, they can also block love, understanding, and genuine closeness. Breaking these walls does not mean removing all boundaries. Healthy boundaries protect a person, while emotional walls prevent connection. The difference is whether the protection allows relationships to exist or completely keeps them outside.